Picture the prehistory already living in your mind. Frozen nights, shivering bodies, cold as the one enemy worth fearing. That picture isn't wrong, but it isn't complete. On the warmer half of the year, when the dark came without any real cold in it, the human body still faced danger, quieter, less remembered, almost missing from the story we tell about our ancestors. If cold wasn't the only killer moving through the ancient night, what made a warm night just as dangerous to sleep through? Close your eyes and place yourself not under snow, not on frozen ground, but somewhere the air itself refuses to cool once the sun goes down. The ground still holds the heat of the day long after dark. There is no frost forming at the edges of the grass, no breath turning to mist. Instead, there is a thickness to the air, a dampness that clings to skin, a hum of insects that never really stops. This is not the picture most people carry when they imagine an ancient night. That picture, the one built from documentaries and textbook covers, is almost always a cold one. Bodies huddled around a fire, breath visible in torchlight, snow pressing in from every side. It is a powerful image, and it is not false, but it is only one slice of a much larger record, cut from a much larger world. For every night spent fighting frost, there were countless nights spent somewhere else entirely, somewhere the danger of the dark had nothing to do with cold at all. To understand what an ancient night actually asked of the human body, the picture has to widen, not narrow. It has to include latitude as well as season, geography as well as climate, because the humans living through those nights were never only cold-weather humans. They were, first and for the longest stretch of their story, humans of warmth. The deepest roots of the human story sit in a warm world. The long paleoanthropological record, built from fossils, from stone tools, from the layered soil of ancient landscapes, places the earliest chapters of the human lineage on the African continent largely within tropical and subtropical latitudes. This is not a controversial claim. It is closer to a settled baseline in the science of human origins, drawn from decades of fossil discovery and genetic study. In these latitudes, the night sky does not usually bring a hard drop into freezing air. Even a full turn of the year rarely produces the kind of biting cold associated with glacial landscapes. What it does produce, again and again, night after night across enormous stretches of time, is warmth that lingers well past sunset, air heavy with moisture near rivers and wetlands, and a kind of darkness that keeps much of its heat rather than losing it. If the earliest human nights were shaped by any single climate at all, it was this one, long before ice sheets or frozen ground ever entered the story. That single fact is enough to unsettle the popular image, because it means the default picture most people hold, the shivering by firelight picture, is not describing the beginning of the story. It is describing a much later chapter, one that belongs to particular migrations into particular latitudes at particular moments, not to the human night in general. Even after populations began moving beyond that original range, a great deal of that movement unfolded along warm corridors before it ever reached anything resembling true cold. Coastal plains, river valleys, and savanna belts across low and middle latitudes offered paths of expansion long before any sustained presence existed in the colder regions we now associate with prehistoric survival stories. None of this erases the reality of cold nights in human history. Populations did eventually settle in colder latitudes, and those nights carried their own well-documented dangers. But treating cold as the default condition of the ancient night, as though every human society everywhere spent its evenings fighting frost, quietly erases a far larger portion of the record. It erases the deserts that cool by day but stay warm through much of the night. It erases the tropics, where night temperature rarely falls low enough to threaten the body directly. It erases entire seasons, in almost every region on Earth, when the night simply does not get cold enough to be the main character of survival. The question this raises is not small. If cold was never the constant threat in so much of the human night, across so much of human geography and so much of human time, then something else had to occupy that space instead. Consider a region far from any ice sheet, a broad savanna where day and night trade places sharply, the sun dropping fast and the sky opening into a wide, warm dark. Archaeological and fossil evidence from long-studied African sites places early hominin activity precisely in landscapes like this, environments researchers describe with real confidence as warm, open, and seasonally variable rather than cold and enclosed. In such a landscape, a body settling down for the night was not fighting to hold on to heat. If anything, it was doing the opposite work, trying to lose heat that the day had already built up and that the ground continued to radiate back long after dusk. This is worth sitting with, because it reverses the entire emotional shape of the usual story. The familiar narrative treats night as the moment cold becomes dangerous and fire becomes salvation. In a warm landscape, fire still mattered, for light, for protection, for the sense of a boundary against the dark, but its role in body temperature was completely different, sometimes even working against the body rather than for it. That single reversal is enough to show that the standard mental model of the ancient night, however comforting and familiar, cannot be treated as universal. Even in the regions people usually picture as classically prehistoric and classically cold, the seasonal record complicates the picture further. Climate history built from ice cores, sediment layers, and long-term temperature reconstructions makes clear that even mid- and higher latitude environments experienced real seasonal swings, with summers warm enough to change nearly everything about how a night unfolded. A population living through a cold winter in one of these regions was not living through the same kind of night 6 months later. Warm season nights in these same landscapes brought their own version of the pattern already visible in the tropics. Air that refused to cool quickly, ground that held its heat, insects and small creatures becoming more active rather than less. None of this is speculation stitched together for effect. It follows directly from well-established climate reconstruction and from basic seasonal biology that still governs these same landscapes today. What it means is that the total number of warm nights across the full sweep of human history, once tropical latitudes, savanna environments, and warm seasons in every other latitude are added together, likely outweighs the number of nights spent fighting true cold. That is not a claim about a precise fraction, because no responsible reading of the evidence allows for a confident percentage here. It is a claim about scale and proportion, strong enough to justify asking a very different question than the one usually asked. That different question is the one this account is built around, just as it was back at that tropical beginning of the story. Not how did humans survive the cold nights, a question already given enormous attention, but what did a warm night actually cost a body and a group who had no cold to fight, only warmth to endure? Picture, again, that same night without frost, without any need to huddle for shared body heat, and ask what problem replaces the one that huddling was meant to solve. A body lying still in warm, humid air is not shielded from every threat simply because the temperature will not drop low enough to be dangerous on its own. Heat retained rather than lost becomes its own kind of pressure. Moisture lost from the body becomes its own kind of risk. And a landscape that stays active and warm after dark rather than falling still and frozen brings its own kind of company through the night. None of these threats carries the same immediate visible urgency as frostbite or hypothermia, which may be part of why they have been so easy to leave out of the popular picture. A collapse from cold is dramatic and countable. A slow accumulation of heat stress, disrupted rest, or exposure to whatever moves more freely in warm darkness is quieter, harder to trace to a single night, and far easier for a simplified story to skip over entirely. Some of why this imbalance persists has less to do with the ancient night itself, and more to do with which parts of the world left behind the clearest traces for later people to study. Cold and temperate regions have often produced durable shelters, hearths, and material remains that preserve well and draw sustained archaeological attention, while many warm, humid environments break down organic material faster and leave a thinner physical record for the same stretch of time. That difference in preservation is a well-recognized limitation within archaeology itself, not a hidden flaw uncovered here, and it means the visibility of cold climate survival in the popular record may say as much about what survives in soil as it does about what most human nights actually looked like. A thinner physical trace does not mean a thinner reality. It means the warm night has been harder to see, not that it mattered less. Add to this the simple weight of numbers. Far more of the low and middle latitude world, across far more of the calendar, sits in the warm range than in the cold one, And the case for centering the ancient night on frost and snow becomes even harder to defend as a general rule rather than a specific, later chapter of the story. This is where the record asks for patience rather than certainty. Paleoanthropology, climate history, and human physiology together support the claim that warm nights were common, widespread, and in no way a minor footnote to the human story, but they do not hand over a simple checklist of every danger those nights carried, and no honest account should pretend otherwise. What can be said with real confidence is that the popular image of the ancient night has quietly organized itself around the assumption that cold was the main character, largely because cold produces threats that are fast, visible, and easy to dramatize. Warmth was rarely absent from that same night, and across a great deal of human history and human geography, warmth was the more constant condition, not cold. Returning once more to that early tropical beginning of the human story reframes everything that follows. If the earliest and, across the full span of time, the most extensive human nights were warm nights, then whatever shaped survival, rest, and vigilance in those hours was shaped first and mostly by heat, not by frost. The question this leaves standing, the one this account will keep circling back to across everything that follows, is simple to state and much harder to answer. If the body was not spending those hours fighting to stay warm, what exactly was it fighting instead? And what did that fight cost across so many centuries of warm, unremarkable, largely unrecorded nights? None of this claims that cold nights were rare or unimportant wherever and whenever they occurred, and none of it claims a precise weight for warm nights against cold ones that the evidence cannot support. What it does claim, carefully and on the strength of geography, climate history, and the deep timeline of human origins, is that warmth deserves a place in this story at least as central as cold has always been given, and that the ancient night, examined honestly across its full range rather than its most dramatic slice, opens a very different set of questions than the ones already familiar. There is a specific feeling that belongs only to a warm night, one that never shows up in the cold version of this story. Skin that stays damp no matter how still a body holds itself, a sheen that will not dry, a heartbeat that seems to sit a little higher in the chest than it does by day. Nothing about this feeling is dramatic enough to wake anyone up in alarm, which is exactly what makes it worth stopping on. A cold night announces its danger through the body immediately, through shivering, through numb fingers, through a cold so sharp it forces action. A warm night does something else entirely. It works quietly, through a system the body already trusts to protect it, and turns that same system into the source of a slow, unannounced cost. To understand what a warm night asked of an ancient body, the place to start is not the mind and not the surroundings, but the skin itself, and the one tool the body has always relied on to keep from overheating. That tool is sweat, and on a warm night it never really stops working, whether anyone is awake to notice or not. Sweating is not a modern inconvenience invented by humid climates or crowded cities. It is one of the oldest and most reliable cooling systems built into the human body, present long before anything resembling a house, a fan, or a glass of water kept within easy reach through the night. When the surrounding air is warm enough that the body cannot simply release heat into it the way it can into cold air, sweat becomes the main way excess heat leaves the body at all. Moisture rises to the surface of the skin, and as it evaporates, it carries heat away with it. This is basic, well-understood physiology, not a claim built for effect, and it applies just as fully to a sleeping body as to a body moving through the heat of the day. The difference is that during sleep, this system keeps running quietly in the background, without conscious attention, without someone deciding to seek shade or reach for water, simply because the body does not stop regulating its temperature the moment the eyes close. On a truly cold night, the danger is visible and sharp enough to interrupt sleep almost immediately, forcing a response before real harm sets in. On a warm night, the body's own defense mechanism can run steadily for hours before anything about it feels urgent enough to notice, which is exactly what makes it easy to overlook in hindsight. This same physiology did not arrive recently in the human story. Thermoregulation, the whole system of sweat glands, blood vessels near the skin, and the redirection of blood flow toward the body's surface to shed heat, is a deeply conserved biological system. shaped over an extremely long stretch of evolutionary time and shared, in broad outline, across the entire span of human history. That matters here because it means the same warm night pressure being described now would have applied just as directly to the earliest humans living in tropical and savanna environments as it does to anyone sleeping through a warm night. Today, there is no reasonable basis for assuming ancient bodies handled heat through some different mechanism. The physiology is the same physiology, inherited rather than invented, which is part of why physiologists treat modern thermal responses as a fair guide to what ancient nights would have demanded of the body as well. What changes across time is not the mechanism itself but the conditions surrounding it, and this is where a warm, humid night becomes genuinely more difficult than a warm, dry one. Evaporation, the actual cooling step in sweating, depends on moisture being able to leave the skin and enter the surrounding air. In dry air, that exchange happens relatively easily, since dry air has plenty of room left to absorb more moisture before it reaches its limit. In humid air, air that is already carrying a heavy load of moisture, sweat has far less room to evaporate, so it simply sits on the skin instead, damp and largely useless as a cooling method, no matter how much of it the body produces. This is precisely why a humid, warm night feels heavier and more exhausting than a dry, warm night at the same temperature, and it is precisely the kind of night common across large stretches of tropical and near-equatorial environments, close to rivers, wetlands, and coastal ground, the same environments tied to the deepest roots of the human story already described. A body in this setting is not failing to cool itself through any weakness or flaw. It is doing exactly what it is built to do, sweating steadily while the surrounding air quietly refuses to let that sweat finish its job. So the moisture stays put, and the heat it was meant to carry away stays put along with it. What this steady background sweating produces, hour after hour through a warm night, is a slow and largely invisible loss of water from the body. During the day, thirst is a fairly reliable signal, prompting a person to drink again and again as fluid is lost through sweat, breath, and simple activity. Sleep interrupts that signal in a way it does not interrupt the sweating itself. A sleeping body continues to lose moisture through the skin and through breathing, but it is not continuously prompted to wake up and correct that loss the way a waking body is prompted to reach for water. Across a single warm night, this can add up to a meaningful amount of fluid lost with no corresponding intake at all, a pattern physiologists sometimes describe as insensible loss. Water leaving the body without the person perceiving it happening in the moment. None of this requires unusually high temperatures or extreme conditions. It follows from ordinary warm, humid air acting on an ordinary sleeping body across several uninterrupted hours, which is exactly the situation a great many ancient nights would have presented across the tropical and seasonal warm environments already described earlier in this account. A cold night, however dangerous, does not carry this same quiet drain, because the body's response to cold works in almost the opposite direction, conserving fluid and heat rather than steadily releasing both into the surrounding air. None of this needs a dramatic setting to be true. It plays out in an ordinary camp, on an ordinary night, with no storm, no predator, and no obvious event that later observers could point to and call a crisis, which is exactly why it has been so easy for a cold-centered picture of the ancient night to leave it out. This is one of the clearest reasons a warm night cannot simply be treated as a safer, gentler version of a cold one. It carries its own physiological cost, distributed quietly across many hours rather than delivered as one obvious alarming signal, and that quietness is precisely what allows it to be underestimated. There is a further layer to this that has less to do with water directly and more to do with what warmth does to sleep itself, and it is worth sitting with before moving further, because it changes what a warm night's danger actually looks like from the outside. Sleep researchers working with modern data have repeatedly observed that a body trying to sleep in warm conditions tends toward more frequent, brief awakenings and a harder time settling into the deeper stages of sleep, compared to a body sleeping in a cooler, more thermally comfortable environment. This is not a claim about ancient behavior pulled from guesswork. It follows from how the same conserved thermoregulatory system interacts with the sleep cycle. Since the body's internal temperature naturally needs to drop somewhat to move into deeper sleep, a drop that becomes harder to achieve when the surrounding air will not cooperate, and the ground beneath a sleeping body is still holding the heat of the day. Applied carefully to an ancient warm night, without overstating what the record can support, this suggests something worth taking seriously. A night spent in warm, humid air was likely not simply uncomfortable in a mild, forgettable way, but structurally harder to get real rest through night after night, across whole seasons and whole regions of the tropical and equatorial world where so much of early human life unfolded. Fragmented sleep does not announce itself the way frostbite does. It does not leave an obvious injury behind by morning that anyone could point to and name. It accumulates instead, night after night, in a way that is much harder to trace, and much easier for a simplified, cold-centered story of the ancient night to leave out entirely. A body that is losing water quietly and sleeping poorly is not facing a single dramatic threat the way a body facing frost is. It is facing a slower kind of erosion, one built from an ordinary night repeated many times over, and this is the part of the picture almost never included when people imagine what an ancient night actually demanded of the people living through it. None of this points to a single clean answer yet, and it should not, because water loss and disrupted sleep both lead toward the same unresolved question rather than settling it. If a body is quietly losing fluid through an entire warm night while asleep, with no chance to notice and correct that loss the way it could during a waking hour, then whatever happened before that night began, in the last hours of daylight, in whatever water was or was not available nearby, mattered in a way that has nothing to do with cold at all. This is not simply a story about the body reacting to heat in isolation. It is a story that reaches outward, toward the landscape around that body, toward rivers, wells, and whatever sources of water existed or did not exist within reach of a given camp on a given warm night, and toward the choices that camp had already made before darkness fell. A body already running a quiet deficit by the time sleep begins is not starting from the same place as a body that entered the night already short on water, and the difference between those two situations may have mattered far more across a warm season than anything to do with temperature alone. Returning once more to that same tropical stretch at the root of the human story, this quiet nightly draining of water is not a rare event tucked into a handful of unusual nights. It sits close to ordinary, repeating across an enormous share of human history in exactly the warm, humid regions already identified as central rather than exceptional to that history. What that difference actually meant for survival, and how ancient life organized itself around the ordinary, unglamorous problem of finding and keeping enough water through a warm season, is where this account turns next. There is a particular kind of attention that settles over a warm evening just before the light fails, one that has nothing to do with gathering fuel or checking the sky for storms. It is the attention a body pays to where water sits, how far away it is, and whether there will be enough of it left by morning. On a cold night, the central task facing a body and a group is holding on to heat, a problem that fire, shelter, and simple closeness can address fairly directly. On a warm night, especially in the humid, tropical, and near equatorial settings already identified as central rather than rare across human history, the central task shifts almost entirely toward water, and it does not go away once the sun sets. If anything, as the previous account already showed, the body keeps losing water quietly through the night regardless of whether anyone is awake to notice, which means whatever water existed within reach before darkness fell was doing work long after the choice to gather it had already been made. This is the part of the ancient night that leaves the least obvious trace and receives the least attention in the popular picture, because thirst rarely produces a single dramatic moment the way cold does. It produces a planning problem instead, one that had to be solved hours before it ever became urgent. The human body is not built to store large reserves of water the way some animals are. There is no internal tank to draw from across a long stretch of heat and exertion, only a set of mechanisms, chiefly in the kidneys, that can concentrate urine and slow water loss somewhat when intake is low, buying a limited amount of time rather than solving the problem outright. This is well-established human physiology, not a claim requiring caution about certainty, and it applies as fully to ancient bodies as to bodies today, since the same conserved biology already discussed governs both. What this means in practice is that a body entering a warm night, already low on water, has very little internal margin to fall back on, and a body that sweats steadily through several humid hours, as already described, narrows that margin further without any conscious decision involved. Unlike a cold night, where a source of frozen water might sit visibly nearby, even if it takes effort and fuel to convert into something drinkable, a warm night in a dry or seasonal environment can bring the opposite problem, with open water sources shrinking, drying at the edges, or becoming harder to reach as a warm season progresses. This is not a claim about every warm environment at every moment. Deserts, savannas, and humid forest edges behave very differently from one another, and any honest account has to hold that variation rather than flattening it into one simple story. A warm night beside a permanent river carries a very different water problem than a warm night on open, dry grassland far from any dependable source. And a warm night in a dense, humid forest edge carries a different problem again, since water there may be abundant even as the air itself stays thick and difficult to move through. What holds across most of these settings, though, is that water is rarely guaranteed simply because a night happens to be warm rather than cold, and in some of these settings a period of intense warmth actually makes water scarcer rather than more available, precisely when the body's own need for it is climbing. A dry season stretching across many warm nights in a row can turn a source that was reliable months earlier into a shrinking pool ringed with cracked mud, visible proof of exactly the kind of gradual, unglamorous pressure this account keeps returning to, a pressure built from repetition rather than a single dramatic event. This is where the deepest roots of the human story become relevant again, and not as a passing detail. Long-standing research in paleoanthropology has repeatedly connected the earliest known sites of hominin activity to the presence of lakes, rivers, and other reliable freshwater sources across the African landscapes already discussed, a pattern strong and consistent enough that many researchers treat proximity to water as one of the clearest, most basic constraints shaping where early human life could take hold at all. This was never simply about daytime drinking. A camp settled near water was a camp with some chance of managing the quiet overnight loss already described, while a camp too far from any reliable source was gambling with a deficit that would only grow once the sweating and breathing of a warm night began working on every sleeping body at once. Archaeological evidence for camp and settlement locations across many later periods continues to show this same pattern. Sites clustered near springs, rivers, and lake margins far more often than chance alone would predict, which is one of the clearest signals available, that access to water shaped where and how groups chose to spend their nights, long before anything like permanent architecture existed to shape that choice instead. Even mobile groups who moved often rather than settling in one place for long stretches still show this same tendency in the archaeological and, in more recent history, ethnographic record, timing, movement, and camp placement around known and trusted water sources rather than treating water as something to be found only once thirst had already become severe. This is a difference worth being precise about. The behavior being described here is not the same as an individual instinct reacting to thirst in the moment, but a broader pattern of decision-making, repeated across generations of groups, that treated water access as a condition to secure ahead of time rather than a problem to solve after the fact. None of this required foresight in the sense of abstract planning laid out on paper. It is closer to a pattern of behavior repeated and reinforced, simply because groups who settled near unreliable water paid a cost that groups near reliable water did not, across enough repeated warm seasons for the pattern to matter. A landscape that stayed generous with water through a warm season supported a very different kind of night than one where the nearest source was reduced to a shrinking pool or a damp streambed by the time evening came. Darkness itself added a further layer of difficulty to all of this that a daytime search for water simply did not carry. Judging how much water remained in a shallow pool, how far a stream had receded, or whether a known source had dried out entirely was far easier to assess in daylight than after the sun had gone down, when visibility narrowed and the risk of moving across unfamiliar or uneven ground grew along with it. This meant that decisions about water on a warm night were rarely made in the moment the need became pressing. They had almost always been made earlier, in the last stretch of daylight, when a group could still see clearly enough to judge a source, fill whatever containers were available, or decide that the current camp no longer offered enough to justify staying. A warm night, in this sense, did not simply test a body's water supply passively. It tested a decision that had already been made hours before the first hour of real thirst arrived, which is part of why the pressure described throughout this account sits so far upstream of anything that would have looked, in the moment, like an obvious crisis. In the second case, the tasks of a warm evening were not simply about settling down to rest. They involved judging how much could reasonably be drunk before sleep without needing to move again in full darkness, weighing that against how far the next reliable source might be if the current one failed entirely, and factoring in whatever small containers or vessels a group happened to have. This last detail is worth being careful with, since the material record here is thinner and more variable than the physiology already discussed. In some regions and periods, archaeologists have identified simple containers, including hollowed gourds and treated eggshells used specifically to hold and carry water, evidence that groups in warm, seasonally dry environments were actively solving this exact problem rather than simply enduring it. In other places and times, especially earlier in the record, the evidence for deliberate water storage is far thinner or effectively absent, and any account claiming otherwise would be overstating what the material record can actually support. What can be said with more confidence is the underlying pressure itself, since the physiology behind it does not depend on which period or region is being discussed. Wherever a warm night met a body that had not secured enough water beforehand, that body was working with a narrower and narrower margin as the hours passed, regardless of whether a container existed to help close that gap. There is also a quieter cost to this pattern that has nothing to do with the water itself, and everything to do with where a group chose to spend the night because of it. Staying close to a reliable water source through a warm season was rarely a free choice made without trade-offs. The same rivers, springs, and lake margins that offered water also offered damp ground, denser vegetation, and a landscape shaped very differently from open, dry terrain further away, conditions that carried their own consequences once darkness fell, quite apart from thirst itself. A group weighing where to settle for the night was rarely balancing water against nothing. It was balancing water against whatever else that same wet, warm ground brought with it once the light faded, a trade-off that becomes much clearer once the full picture of a warm, humid environment after dark is laid out rather than left as a single detail on its own. None of this settles into a tidy resolution yet, and it is not meant to. The picture so far includes a body losing water quietly through sleep, a landscape that does not reliably hand that water back simply because a night happens to be warm, and a pattern of settlement stretching back to the earliest known human sites, shaped in part by exactly this pressure. What remains open is what else came bundled together with the water itself, since choosing to stay near a damp, warm source through the night was never a decision made in isolation from everything else that thrives in exactly that kind of ground once the sun goes down. That is where this account turns next, toward what shares the warm, wet edges of a night alongside the humans trying to survive it, and what that shared space actually meant once darkness settled in fully around both. There is a sound that begins to change once a warm night settles fully in, one that has nothing to do with wind or water, and everything to do with the ground itself waking up in a way daylight never allowed. Insects, small and easy to overlook by comparison with anything a person might call a predator, become one of the most consistent and least discussed sources of disruption once darkness meets warmth, and the water sources already described as essential to surviving a warm night turn out to be exactly where this second layer of the story concentrates most heavily. This is not a coincidence built for narrative effect. Standing water, damp ground, and dense vegetation near rivers, springs, and lake margins are precisely the conditions many biting and disease-carrying insects rely on to breed and remain active, which means the same landscape features that made a camp survivable through the quiet water loss of a warm night were often the same features that made it a gathering point for exactly this kind of activity once the sun went down. A group settling near reliable water was never simply solving one problem in isolation. It was trading one clear, well-understood risk for a second, quieter one that arrived bundled together with the water itself, inseparable from it in most warm, humid environments across the tropical and near equatorial world already established as central to this story rather than exceptional. The biology behind why insects become more active at night in warm conditions is well documented rather than speculative. Many biting insects regulate their own activity around temperature and humidity, and a warm, still, moist night provides exactly the conditions many species require to fly, feed, and reproduce most efficiently, while a cold night suppresses this activity sharply enough that it becomes far less relevant to the picture. This is part of why the cold-centered version of the ancient night, already shown to be incomplete on the question of water, is incomplete here as well. A body sheltering from frost was never dealing with this particular pressure in any serious way, since the insects capable of causing the most disruption are themselves suppressed by the same cold that was already dangerous for other reasons. A body sheltering through a warm, humid night faced the opposite situation, temperature and moisture working together to create ideal conditions for exactly the creatures most likely to disturb rest, break skin, and in some documented cases transmit disease, all without requiring any dramatic event to explain why a given night felt worse than expected. This connects directly back to the deepest roots of the human story already discussed at length. The tropical and savanna landscapes tied to the earliest known hominin sites were not simply warm and near water. They were, and in many cases still are, environments supporting substantial insect populations shaped by exactly the same temperature and moisture conditions already described as central to human origins. Researchers working in evolutionary biology and parasitology have long treated insect exposure, including biting insects capable of carrying disease, as a meaningful and continuous pressure across the span of human evolutionary history in these regions, distinct from but running alongside the water and heat pressures already covered. This is not the same as claiming any single insect or disease defined the ancient night on its own, a claim the evidence does not support and this account will not make. It is closer to recognizing a steady, low-grade pressure present across an enormous number of ordinary warm nights rather than concentrated into rare dramatic outbreaks. Exactly the kind of pressure this account has kept returning to throughout, one built from repetition rather than a single visible crisis. Fire, already established as playing a different and more complicated role on a warm night than on a cold one, resurfaces here in a way worth sitting with carefully. Smoke and firelight are known, including in later historical and ethnographic records, to have some effect on discouraging certain flying insects from approaching closely, which means fire on a warm night was very likely serving a genuinely different function than it served on a cold night. Where a cold night asked fire to provide heat directly to the body, a warm night, according to this same evidence, may have asked fire to do something closer to holding a boundary against exactly the disruption just described, even while that same fire was simultaneously adding unwanted heat to an already warm environment. A tension already introduced earlier in this account and worth remembering here rather than treating as resolved. This is a genuine trade-off, not a simple solution, and any version of this story claiming fire fixed the insect problem on a warm night would be overstating what the evidence actually shows. What can be said with more confidence is that groups facing this pressure were not without any tools at all, only that every available tool on a warm night seems to have come with its own cost attached. A pattern consistent with everything already described about water, sleep, and heat across this account. The disruption itself deserves to be described honestly rather than dramatically. This was rarely a single dangerous encounter remembered as an isolated event. It was closer to an accumulation, bites disturbing already fragmented sleep already made harder to achieve by warmth itself, skin left more vulnerable to irritation and infection in humid conditions where wounds do not dry and close as quickly as they do in cooler, drier air, and in some regions and periods, exposure to insects capable of transmitting disease across repeated nights rather than a single unlucky one. Modern research into vector-borne disease continues to identify warm, humid, near-water conditions as consistently associated with higher insect activity and higher transmission risk compared to cooler or drier conditions. A pattern grounded in current data that provides a reasonable, cautious basis for understanding why the same conditions would very likely have mattered for ancient bodies as well, without requiring any invented detail about specific ancient outbreaks or events the evidence cannot actually confirm. What begins to take shape across sleep, water, and now this steady insect pressure is not a single dramatic danger belonging to any one night, but a layered condition belonging to an enormous number of ordinary warm nights repeated across a very long stretch of human history. None of these pressures on its own explains everything, and none of them should be treated as though it does. What remains is the question of how a body and a group, facing all of this at once, without the option of retreating indoors or waiting it out in isolation, actually arrange themselves through a warm night in order to manage it. A question that reaches past any single individual body and toward the shape of the group itself, how closely or how far apart people chose to lie, and what that arrangement was actually protecting against once every pressure already described is held together rather than considered one at a time. Picture two versions of the same group settling down for the night, separated only by temperature rather than by time or place. In the cold version, bodies draw inward, shoulder against shoulder, a tight knot of warmth built from shared heat that no single body could hold on to alone, breath and warmth passing between people pressed close enough that the space between them barely exists at all. In the warm version, that same instinct works against the very thing the body is trying to do. Lying close to another warm body on a warm night adds heat rather than sharing relief from it, presses skin against skin in a way that blocks the airflow sweat depends on to evaporate and actually cool anything, and turns the comfort of closeness into one more obstacle stacked on top of everything already described about a warm night's quiet physical cost. Two bodies that would have been a source of survival on a cold night become, on a warm one, simply two more sources of heat with nowhere to go. This is not a small detail. It means the basic social geometry of sleep, the actual physical shape a group takes once everyone settles down for the night, could not have stayed the same across a cold night and a warm one, even if the people, the location, and the surrounding dangers were otherwise identical. Sleep researchers and anthropologists studying contemporary populations across a range of climates have repeatedly observed exactly this kind of shift, with people in warmer conditions tending toward more physical distance between sleeping bodies compared to people in colder conditions, where closeness and shared body heat carry an obvious and immediate benefit. Bedding practices, sleeping surface choices, and even the layout of shared sleeping spaces documented across different climate zones tend to reflect this same underlying logic: closeness where cold makes it valuable, and distance where warmth makes closeness costly instead. This pattern is documented carefully enough and repeated across enough different populations and settings that it can be treated as a reasonable and fairly confident guide to how climate shapes sleeping arrangements more broadly, while still being careful not to claim any single ancient group followed this pattern in a specific, undocumented way. Applied cautiously to the deep tropical roots of the human story already established, this suggests that a great deal of ancient sleep, across a great deal of ancient history, likely did not resemble the tightly huddled image so often used to represent prehistoric life in general. That image belongs more precisely to cold nights and cold seasons, a real and important part of the story, but not, as already shown repeatedly throughout this account, the default condition of most human nights across most of human geography and most of human time. What this spacing actually changed was not comfort alone, it changed the basic shape of safety itself. A tightly huddled group sleeping close together on a cold night forms a compact, dense cluster with a small perimeter, meaning fewer points where a threat could approach unnoticed, and fewer individuals needed to watch that smaller boundary at any given moment. A group spread further apart to manage heat on a warm night occupies more physical space, which means a larger perimeter, more gaps between sleeping bodies, and more distance for any sound, movement, or danger to travel before reaching someone still alert enough to notice it. The mathematics of this are simple enough to picture without any need for precise figures. The same number of people, arranged more loosely across more ground, cannot cover that ground with the same density of attention a tight cluster naturally provides, which means something else had to compensate for the gap this spacing created, or the group's safety on a warm night would have been measurably weaker than its safety on a cold one for reasons that had nothing to do with any actual increase in outside danger. This is a genuine trade-off rather than a simple loss. Spacing bodies out solved the heat and sweat problem already described in detail, but it did so by trading away some of the dense, built-in protection that closeness naturally provided on a cold night, a trade-off that had to be managed some other way if the group intended to remain safe through the night rather than simply cooler. The way many groups appear to have managed this trade-off was not through any single fixed solution, but through the structure of vigilance itself, spread across the group rather than concentrated in one obvious watch person. Research into the sleep patterns of contemporary hunter-gatherer populations, most notably long-term observational studies of groups such as the Hadza in East Africa, a region well within the warm, tropical zone already discussed throughout this account, has found something genuinely striking. Across an entire night, there is very often at least one person awake, somewhere within the group, at almost any given moment, even though no single individual is assigned to stay awake on purpose. This pattern emerges not from a formal night watch schedule, but from natural variation in when different people tend to wake, doze, and fall back asleep. Variation shaped in part by age, and by differences in individual sleep timing across a group made up of children, adults, and older members with different natural sleep rhythms. Older adults in many studied populations tend to wake earlier and sleep somewhat lighter than younger adults, while infants and young children wake frequently through the night for reasons of their own, and adolescents and younger adults often stay awake latest into the evening, a pattern researchers sometimes describe as a kind of natural relay running quietly through the group without anyone organizing it on purpose. This is where the structure of a group across generations becomes directly relevant to a warm night's safety. Since a population made up of people at different life stages, sleeping on somewhat different schedules for reasons that have nothing to do with danger at all, ends up producing a kind of continuous, distributed alertness, almost as a side effect of that same generational variation, an outcome no single person had to plan or enforce directly. It is worth being careful about how far this observation should be stretched. Contemporary hunter-gatherer groups are not frozen replicas of ancient populations, and drawing a straight line from a modern study to a specific ancient night would overstate what the comparison can actually support. What can be said more cautiously is that the underlying biology behind these generational differences in sleep timing, differences tied to age and development rather than to any particular culture or era, is unlikely to be a recent invention, which makes this kind of naturally distributed vigilance a reasonable pattern to expect across a very long stretch of human history, rather than a modern anomaly unique to the groups currently being studied. This matters more on a warm night than it might first appear, precisely because the wider, more spread-out sleeping arrangement already described increases the physical area that vigilance needs to cover. A dense, huddled cluster on a cold night could rely more heavily on sheer physical closeness as a form of passive protection, since anything approaching had to cross a very short distance to reach anyone at all. A spread-out group on a warm night could not lean on that same closeness, which means the natural generational variation in sleep timing just described was doing real protective work, effectively covering a wider perimeter through the ordinary, unplanned rhythm of who happened to be lightly asleep or briefly awake at any given hour, rather than through any single dedicated guard. None of this should be mistaken for a claim that ancient groups consciously understood or engineered this system in any deliberate sense. It is closer to recognizing that a population with a natural mix of ages and sleep rhythms already possessed a built-in advantage for exactly this kind of distributed vigilance, one that a warm, spread-out sleeping arrangement would have needed and very likely benefited from, whether or not anyone within that group ever thought about it in those terms. Fire, already discussed in relation to both temperature and insect activity earlier in this account, resurfaces again here in a slightly different role. On a warm night, with bodies spread further apart than a cold night would have allowed, a central fire could still serve as a shared reference point, holding a widened group together, a single visible anchor at the center of an arrangement that had otherwise traded closeness for cooler, more breathable space between sleepers. A person waking briefly in the night, one link in the natural relay of light sleepers already described, did not need to be lying close to anyone else to orient themselves within the group. A glance toward the fire was often enough to confirm the shape of the camp was still intact, a small but meaningful function that had nothing to do with warmth or insects, and everything to do with holding a spread-out group together as a single recognizable unit through the dark. This does not resolve the trade-off already described, since fire was still adding heat to an already warm environment even as it provided light and a sense of shared orientation across a wider camp. It simply means the group was not without any organizing structure at all, only that the structure had shifted from tight physical closeness towards something looser, held together by a shared point of light, and by the same generational variation in sleep already described, rather than by proximity between bodies alone. None of this means a warm night's wider sleeping arrangement was somehow equal in safety to a cold night's tight cluster, only that it was managed differently, through mechanisms that leave far less obvious physical trace than a huddled ring of bodies around a fire would leave in the archaeological or ethnographic record. A generational rhythm of light sleep does not fossilize. A moment of brief, unplanned wakefulness triggered by a distant sound leaves nothing behind for anyone to find later. This is, once again, exactly the kind of quiet, structurally significant pattern that a cold-centered story of the ancient night has little reason to include, since nothing about it announces itself the way frostbite, a snowdrift, or a huddled ring of bodies preserved by chance would. What remains open here is what exactly that wider perimeter, held together by shared fire and distributed vigilance rather than tight closeness, actually had to watch for through a warm night. The gaps between spread out, sleeping bodies were not empty of consequence simply because a person happened to be awake somewhere in the group at any given moment. What moved through those gaps, and what kind of threat a warm night's wider, more open sleeping arrangement was actually built to notice, is where this account turns next. What moved through the gaps between spread out, sleeping bodies, night after night, was rarely a single dramatic silhouette crossing open ground in full view. More often it was the ordinary traffic of an ecosystem that, unlike the frozen, silenced landscape of a cold night, had not gone still at all once the sun went down. Somewhere beyond the reach of the fire, grass moves that is not being moved by wind, and the sound settles back into the quiet dark before anyone can be entirely certain what caused it. Temperature governs activity across an enormous share of the animal world, not only for the handful of predators most often imagined in a dramatic retelling of the ancient night, but across nearly every layer of a warm landscape at once. Many reptiles and other cold-blooded animals depend directly on external warmth to move efficiently at all, since their own body temperature tracks the temperature around them rather than being generated internally the way a human body's is, which means a warm night, unlike a cold one, keeps a meaningful share of that layer of the ecosystem active rather than dormant. Warm-blooded animals shift their patterns too, often timing activity to avoid the harshest heat of the day and moving instead through the cooler, though still warm, hours after sunset, which means a warm night does not empty a landscape the way a cold one often does. A cold night, whatever its own dangers, tends to suppress movement broadly across an ecosystem, slowing many animals enough that the surrounding darkness genuinely does grow quieter as the temperature drops. Small comfort as that may have been against the more direct threat of the cold itself, a warm night does close to the opposite. The same conditions that made sleep harder to achieve and water harder to hold on to, already described at length throughout this account, are conditions under which much of the surrounding landscape stays awake and moving right alongside the humans trying to rest within it, a landscape that does not pause its own business simply because a group of people nearby has decided the day is over. This matters directly for the spread-out sleeping arrangement already described. A widened camp, its bodies spaced further apart to manage heat rather than pulled close for shared warmth, produces exactly the kind of gaps a more active nighttime landscape has more opportunity to move through unnoticed. The natural generational relay of light sleepers already discussed provided some coverage across that widened perimeter, but coverage is not the same as certainty, and a landscape with more moving through it after dark simply gives that coverage more to catch, more small sounds to filter, more shapes at the edge of firelight to weigh against nothing more than instinct and the accumulated experience of many similar nights before it. This is not a claim that ancient camps were under constant dramatic assault from predators every warm night, that would overstate the evidence considerably and lean into exactly the kind of sensational framing this account has avoided throughout. It is a more modest and better supported claim that the baseline level of animal movement near a warm night camp was very likely higher than the baseline level near a cold night camp, for reasons rooted in basic, well-established ecology, rather than speculation about any specific dramatic encounter. the fossil and archaeological record offers some genuine, if carefully bounded, evidence relevant to this picture. Paleoanthropological research has identified tooth marks and other signs of carnivore involvement on a number of early hominin fossil remains, findings that researchers in this field have used to reconstruct at least some interactions between early humans and the larger predators sharing their landscape. This evidence is treated by the researchers who study it with real caution, since it is genuinely difficult to distinguish predation from scavenging after death in many cases, meaning a tooth mark on an ancient bone does not automatically prove an animal killed a living person, rather than simply encountering remains after death occurred some other way, and any single find can rarely support a large or dramatic claim on its own. Researchers working in this area typically build their conclusions from patterns across many sites and many specimens over long periods of study, rather than from any one striking discovery treated as decisive proof, which is the same careful, cumulative approach this account has tried to apply throughout, rather than leaning on any single dramatic detail. Some of this evidence points toward large cats among the more consistently documented predators sharing landscape and, in places, direct contact with early hominin populations, though researchers are careful to note that the picture likely included a range of predators and scavengers rather than any single species carrying the bulk of this pressure across every region and period being studied. What this evidence does support, taken as a body of research built up over many sites and many years rather than any single striking discovery, is that early humans shared their landscape, including the landscape immediately around their sleeping sites, with large carnivores capable of representing a real and recurring pressure, distinct from the quieter, slower pressures of water and insects already described, though very likely connected to the same warm, tropical, water-rich environments already established as central to this entire account. Since predator and prey alike were drawn toward the very same rivers and lake margins that shaped where early human camps tended to settle in the first place. Fire returns here in a role that will already feel familiar by now, though worth restating clearly in this specific context. A meaningful body of research, spanning both the archaeological record and observations of contemporary human and animal behavior, supports the idea that fire has a real deterrent effect on many large animals, discouraging close approach in a way that darkness alone does not provide. Many predators rely heavily on stealth, approaching prey unseen and unheard until the final moment, and a steady, visible flame disrupts exactly that strategy, removing the cover of full darkness across at least some radius around a camp, and giving anyone lightly awake within that radius, whether by the natural generational relay already described or simple chance, a genuine chance to notice movement before it closes the remaining distance. This is one of the clearer, more direct explanations available for why fire mattered so consistently across human history, even in warm environments where its role in body temperature, already discussed earlier in this account, was genuinely complicated rather than straightforwardly beneficial. A warm night's fire was very likely doing less work warming bodies that did not want to be warmed further, and more work holding a visible, active boundary against a landscape that, unlike a cold one, had not gone quiet. This reframes fire once again, not as a single tool with one fixed purpose across every kind of night, but as something whose actual function shifted depending on which pressure, cold, insects, or animal movement, mattered most in a given setting, a pattern consistent with everything else. This account has described about warm nights demanding a different kind of response than cold ones, rather than simply a lesser version of the same response. Even so, a fire's protective radius was never unlimited, and nothing in the available evidence suggests it eliminated risk entirely rather than reducing it, a distinction worth holding on to rather than letting the comforting image of firelight quietly slide into a claim of complete safety the evidence cannot actually support. None of this should be read as suggesting predation was the single defining danger of a warm night, overshadowing everything already discussed about water and sleep and insects. It sits alongside those pressures rather than above them, one more layer in a night that, across its full range of demands, asks considerably more of a body and a group than the popular, cold-centered picture typically allows for, What makes this layer distinct from the others already covered is that it interacts directly with the spatial arrangement described in the previous account. The spacing between sleeping bodies and the distributed vigilance meant to compensate for it. A wider perimeter with more gaps was not simply managing heat and comfort in isolation. It was managing heat and comfort while also standing as the actual boundary against a landscape that, on a warm night, had considerably more moving through it than a frozen one ever would. The same choice that solved one problem, spacing bodies out to let sweat do its work, quietly raised the stakes of another, since every additional gap between sleepers was also additional ground a moving animal could cross before anyone noticed. A trade-off layered directly on top of the trade-off already described between comfort and perimeter density in the previous account. Taken together, everything covered so far, quiet water loss through sleep, the search for and defense of water sources, insect activity concentrated near exactly those same sources, a wider and more exposed sleeping arrangement required to manage heat, and now a more active surrounding landscape, moving through the gaps that arrangement created, begins to sketch a very different shape for the ancient warm night than the simple, singular image of frost and shivering ever could. None of these pressures on its own would necessarily register as dramatic or memorable. Stacked together, repeated across an enormous number of ordinary nights spread across the tropical and warm seasonal environments already established as central rather than exceptional to human history, they describe something closer to a sustained, low-grade cost carried across generations, rather than a single dangerous event any one person would have pointed to and named. This is, in many ways, the clearest reason the popular picture of the ancient night has left so much of this out. A single frostbitten hand tells a simple, memorable story. A body that lost water quietly, slept lightly for reasons layered 5 different ways, and never once needed to fend off a visible attacker tells no simple story at all, even though the cumulative weight of those ordinary nights, repeated across an entire human lifetime and across generations beyond it, was very likely just as consequential in its own way. What remains is the question of what all of this actually did to sleep itself, not as a single mechanism already described in isolation back when only heat and sweat were part of the picture, but as the accumulated experience of a body trying to rest through water loss, insect disturbance, spatial exposure, and a landscape that would not go still, all layered onto the same warm ordinary night. That accumulated experience, and what it actually cost a body and a group across the many hours it was supposed to be resting, is where this account turns next. There is a particular kind of tiredness that has no single cause behind it, the kind that shows up not after one hard night, but after many ordinary ones stacked quietly on top of each other, and it is exactly the kind of tiredness a warm night, taken as a whole, was built to produce. It does not arrive as a sudden collapse or a single memorable bad night. It arrives the way a slow current wears down a riverbank, invisible from one day to the next, unmistakable once enough days have passed to compare against. Everything already described across this account, the slow loss of water through sweat, the insects drawn to the same water that made a camp survivable, the wider spacing between bodies and the animal movement that spacing had to guard against, none of these pressures needed to strike hard or all at once to matter. What they actually did, working together across a single ordinary night, was interrupt sleep itself over and over, in small ways that rarely woke a person fully but almost never let them rest completely either. To understand what this meant for a body, the place to look is not any one of these pressures in isolation, already covered at length, but the sleep cycle itself, the underlying rhythm every one of those interruptions was cutting into. Sleep is not a single, uniform state that a body simply enters and remains in until morning. It moves in cycles, shifting between lighter stages and deeper ones, including a distinctive stage often associated with dreaming, each stage serving a different kind of restorative function, and each cycle repeating several times across a full night if nothing interrupts it. A full, undisturbed night typically allows a body to move through several of these cycles in sequence, spending progressively longer stretches in the deeper, more restorative stages as the night goes on, provided nothing keeps pulling the body back toward wakefulness before that progression can complete itself. Reaching the deeper stages of this cycle depends, in part, on the body's own internal temperature dropping somewhat from its daytime level, a natural part of the sleep process that researchers have documented consistently in modern sleep studies. This drop is harder to achieve when the surrounding air will not cooperate, when the ground beneath a sleeping body is still radiating the heat of the day, and when the body's own cooling system, the sweating already described in detail earlier in this account, is struggling to finish its job in humid air. A body trying to sleep through this kind of night is, in a very real physiological sense, fighting an uphill battle against its own biology every time it tries to settle into anything deeper than the lightest stage of rest, restarting that climb again and again, rather than progressing steadily toward the longer, deeper stretches a full night is meant to include. There is a further layer to this worth being precise about, since it is well documented in modern research rather than a matter of speculation. The stage of sleep most closely associated with dreaming appears to be especially sensitive to ambient warmth, in part because the body's usual tools for regulating temperature, sweating and shivering among them, are naturally suppressed during this stage far more than during other parts of the sleep cycle. This means a body entering that particular stage on a warm, humid night is doing so with fewer of its normal defenses available, at precisely the moment those defenses would be most useful. A mismatch researchers have linked to shorter, more frequent, and more easily disrupted stretches of this stage under warm sleeping conditions compared to cooler ones. This is not a mechanism unique to modern humans living in artificially heated or air-conditioned environments. It reflects a basic feature of mammalian sleep physiology, present across the same long evolutionary timeline already discussed. When this account first established that thermoregulation itself is a deeply conserved system rather than a recent development, applied cautiously to an ancient warm night, without overstating what the evidence can support, this suggests something specific rather than vague. It was very likely not simply harder to fall asleep in warm, humid conditions, but harder to stay within the deeper, more restorative parts of the sleep cycle once sleep had begun, a distinction that matters because the two problems, difficulty falling asleep and difficulty staying in deep sleep, would have produced a very different kind of tiredness than either one alone. This is where the layered pressures already described throughout this account stop being separate items on a list and start behaving like a single combined force, acting on the same vulnerable window. A body already working hard to reach deep sleep because of ambient warmth does not need a dramatic event to be pulled back out of it. A distant sound from the more active nighttime landscape already described, a bite from an insect drawn to the same water source that made the camp viable, the simple discomfort of overheated, damp skin, any one of these was enough to interrupt a sleep cycle that was already fragile to begin with, precisely because the deeper stages of that cycle were harder to enter and easier to lose on a warm night than on a cool one. A body might drift down toward deeper sleep only to be nudged back up toward a lighter stage by nothing more than a shift in the ground's warmth beneath it, then begin the climb again, over and over, dozens of times across a single night, without any single moment of that process ever rising to the level of a memorable disturbance. None of these interruptions needed to be remembered clearly by morning to have mattered. A brief partial waking, followed by a return to sleep within a minute or two, leaves little or no memory behind, which is part of why this entire layer of the ancient night has been so easy for a simpler, cold-centered story to overlook. Nothing about it looks, from the outside or in hindsight, like an event at all, and that is precisely what makes it so easy to leave out of any account built primarily around visible, nameable dangers. A useful comparison sits close at hand here, one already introduced earlier in this account. A cold night, however dangerous in its own right, does not carry this particular cost in anywhere near the same way. Once a body is adequately warmed, whether by fire, by shared body heat, or by simple shelter from wind, its own internal temperature is free to fall the way sleep naturally requires, since the surrounding cold is not competing against that drop the way ambient warmth does. This is part of why a cold night, despite its very real dangers already acknowledged throughout this account, does not carry the same structural cost to sleep architecture itself. The danger there is sharper and more immediate, but the sleep achieved in the hours before that danger becomes acute is in a strictly physiological sense closer to complete. A warm night offers close to the reverse trade, less acute, moment-to-moment danger from temperature alone, but a steadier, quieter erosion of the sleep cycle itself, spread across every hour rather than concentrated into any single dangerous moment. The natural, generational relay of light sleepers already discussed earlier in this account, the pattern in which someone within a group tends to be at least lightly awake at almost any given point through the night, takes on a different meaning once this sleep architecture is factored in directly. That pattern was not simply a matter of some individuals happening to be more alert than others by chance. It reflects the same underlying vulnerability being described here, a night that made deep, sustained sleep genuinely harder to hold on to for everyone, distributed unevenly across a group according to differences already tied to age and natural sleep timing. Older members of a group, waking earlier and more lightly for reasons already discussed, were not simply choosing to stay alert out of caution. Their own sleep architecture on a warm night was shaped by the same physiological pressures being described here, just as much as it was for anyone younger sleeping nearby. A watch that seems, from one angle, like a built-in safety mechanism, was very likely also, from another angle, a direct symptom of how fragile sleep itself had become across an entire group facing the same warm, humid conditions at once. These are not two separate explanations competing with each other. They describe the same pattern, viewed from the side of safety and from the side of physiology, both rooted in the same underlying difficulty, a warm night created for reaching and holding deep, uninterrupted rest, two readings of one fact rather than a choice between them. None of this points toward any single dramatic consequence the following morning, and it should not, since nothing about this account has claimed collapse or crisis as the outcome of an ordinary warm night. What modern sleep research does support, cautiously and without exaggeration, is that repeated fragmented sleep across many nights in a row is associated with measurable effects on next-day alertness, mood, and physical recovery, effects that accumulate gradually rather than announcing themselves after any single night. Attention narrows slightly. Reaction to minor irritations sharpens. The body's own recovery processes, the quiet repair work ordinarily carried out during deeper sleep stages, have less uninterrupted time in which to do that work thoroughly. None of these changes would have been dramatic enough on their own, after a single night, to stand out as anything worth naming, which is exactly why this layer of the ancient night, like so many already described throughout this account, is the kind of cost history simply does not preserve a clear record of. Applied to the deep tropical roots of the human story already established throughout this account, this suggests that an enormous share of ancient human history was lived by bodies operating, night after night, with a form of rest that was real and necessary but structurally less complete than the rest available on a genuinely cool night, a condition closer to a constant, low background cost than to any single crisis a person could point back to and name. What remains open, after water, insects, animals, spacing, and now sleep itself, have each been laid out as part of the same warm night, is what happened when this already difficult picture met an additional layer of weather entirely separate from heat on its own, the kind of warm season storm, rain and humidity that could turn an already fragile night into something considerably harder to manage, without ever once bringing the cold this whole account has spent so long setting aside. That is where this account turns next. Picture the same group preparing to sleep in the same place, but under two different kinds of night. When the air is cold, bodies naturally move inward. People lie close enough to share warmth, children may be placed between older bodies, and whatever coverings exist are gathered over several sleepers rather than spread thinly across the ground. The group becomes compact because closeness solves an immediate problem. Every nearby body produces heat, and every reduced gap leaves less space for cold air to move between them. On a warm night, that same arrangement begins to work against the body. Another person is no longer a source of welcome heat, but another warm surface beside skin already struggling to cool. Shoulders touching, legs overlapping, and shared coverings hold warm, damp air close to the body. Sweat remains trapped rather than evaporating, and even a faint breeze can no longer pass freely across the skin. Long before anyone understood the physiology of heat loss, discomfort itself would have encouraged a different sleeping shape. People would turn away from one another, leave spaces between bodies, move toward the edges of a shelter, or choose patches of ground where air could pass more easily. This does not require imagining a formal plan followed by every ancient group. It is simply the kind of repeated adjustment human bodies make when closeness becomes too warm to tolerate. Archaeology cannot preserve the exact distance between sleepers lying on grass, leaves, hides, or bare earth thousands of years ago. Most of those materials decay, and the positions of bodies disappear with them. For that reason, no responsible reconstruction can claim to know precisely how one prehistoric camp arranged itself on one hot night. Yet the biological pressure behind the arrangement is clear. Human sleep is closely linked to the body's ability to release heat, and excessively warm surroundings tend to increase wakefulness and disturb deeper sleep. Clothing, coverings, the temperature of the ground, and the amount of air moving around the skin all influence how difficult that release becomes. When several bodies are pressed together, each condition becomes less favorable for cooling. The likely response was not to abandon the group, because sleeping alone carried dangers of its own, but to loosen it. Instead of one dense cluster, the camp may have become a wider, thinner pattern of sleepers, still within sight or hearing of one another. A parent might remain close to a young child while leaving more space on the other side. Older people might choose the most stable or sheltered ground, while adults able to move easily took positions nearer the outside. Some sleepers might lie beyond the strongest heat of the fire, while others remain near enough to tend it when necessary. These possibilities should be treated as cautious inferences rather than universal facts, because climate, landscape, age, shelter, and local custom would all have shaped the final arrangement. What matters is the underlying reversal. In cold conditions, safety from temperature encouraged contraction. In hot conditions, relief from temperature encouraged separation. That separation changed more than comfort. The same number of people now occupied a larger area. The boundary of the sleeping group stretched farther into darkness, and the spaces between one person and the next became wider. A sound near the edge might no longer be heard equally well by everyone. A person waking in the center might not immediately sense what was happening several body lengths away. By moving apart to let heat escape, the group quietly exchanged some of the protection created by density for the chance to sleep with less trapped warmth. The hot night therefore changed the geometry of the camp before it changed anything else. And that wider geometry would soon create a second problem: how a scattered group could remain alert enough to protect a boundary that had become larger simply because the air was warm. Once the sleeping group had widened, the problem of safety changed with it. In a cold night, people lying close together formed a compact center, and any movement near the edge of the group had only a short distance to travel before someone felt, heard, or saw it. In a hot night, the same number of sleepers could be spread across a much broader patch of ground. The spaces between them allowed air to move, but they also created gaps in attention. A sound near one person might not wake another. A shadow crossing the outer edge of the camp could pass farther before reaching the firelight. This did not mean that ancient groups simply accepted greater danger whenever the night was warm. More likely, they relied on a different kind of protection, one based less on physical closeness and more on the fact that human sleep is rarely perfectly synchronized across an entire group. Even when everyone appears to be resting, some people fall asleep later, some wake briefly during the night, and others rise before dawn. Age contributes to these differences. Younger adults may remain awake longer into the evening. Parents may stir when children move, and older adults often sleep more lightly or wake earlier than the rest of the group. These differences do not need to be organized into a formal watch schedule to become useful. Taken together, they can create a loose relay of awareness, with one person or another awake for short periods while most of the group remains asleep. Research among living foraging communities has documented this kind of variation, though such communities should never be treated as unchanged copies of prehistoric populations. The value of the comparison lies in the underlying human biology, not in assuming identical customs across thousands of years. Different sleep rhythms within a mixed age group are common enough to suggest that ancient groups may also have benefited from moments when the camp was never entirely unconscious at once. On a hot night, this would have mattered more because the sleeping area was larger and its boundary less compact. Someone waking to drink, move away from an insect, adjust position, or tend a weakening fire could briefly listen to the darkness and notice whether anything had changed. Another person might wake later for a completely different reason and take over that small unplanned period of awareness. No single sleeper needed to remain alert for the whole night. Vigilance could pass quietly from person to person through ordinary interruptions that heat itself had already made more common. This created another warm night paradox. Fragmented sleep reduced the quality of rest, but the same fragmentation may have made a scattered group slightly harder to approach without detection. The protection was limited and imperfect. A person who woke for only a moment might miss a faint sound. Someone near the center of the camp could not watch every gap between sleepers. Children, illness, exhaustion, and age could also weaken attention rather than strengthen it. Yet a group containing many different sleep patterns had an advantage over a group in which every person became deeply asleep at the same moment. Fire likely helped hold this looser arrangement together. Even when its heat was unwelcome, its light marked the center of the camp and gave waking sleepers a fixed point of orientation. A brief glance toward the flames could show whether the fire had dimmed, whether familiar bodies remained in place, and whether movement at the edge belonged to someone within the group or something beyond it. In this way, hot nights may have encouraged a form of safety built not from huddling, but from spacing, intermittent wakefulness, and attention shared unevenly across generations. The group remained together, but it did so in a wider and more fragile shape, one that had to be protected by awareness rather than warmth. By the final hours before dawn, the wider sleeping arrangement of a hot night had created a pattern that was neither as secure as a cold huddle, nor as isolated as sleeping alone. It depended on small adjustments repeated through the group, someone shifting closer to a child, someone moving toward the fire after noticing it had burned low, someone else choosing the outer edge because they slept lightly and could hear movement sooner. None of these actions required a formal command, and there is no reason to imagine that every group followed the same arrangement, but the basic pressure would have been widely shared. Heat pushed bodies apart, while danger still required them to remain socially connected. The result was a camp held together less by touch and more by sound, sight, and the expectation that other people were still near enough to respond. This changed the meaning of age within the sleeping group. Older adults, who often sleep more lightly and wake earlier, may have contributed to the first awareness of approaching dawn or of unusual movement in the dark. Younger adults, more likely to remain awake later, could cover the first part of the night without being assigned a special role. Parents and caregivers responded to infants and children whose sleep was naturally broken into shorter periods. Each generation carried a different rhythm, and together those rhythms may have reduced the length of time when everyone was deeply asleep at once. The advantage was not perfect vigilance. A tired person could fail to notice danger, and repeated waking reduced the recovery the body needed after a demanding day. Yet the group's mixed ages created a kind of overlapping attention that a single sleeper could never provide. This may have been especially important in warm environments where the outer edge of the camp remained active with insects, reptiles, scavengers, and larger animals moving during the cooler hours after sunset. The physical arrangement also affected how quickly the group could react. In a tight cluster, waking one person might immediately disturb several others through touch and movement. In a spread-out camp, an alarm had to travel farther. A spoken warning, a sudden movement toward the fire, or the sharp reaction of one person at the edge could serve as the signal that pulled separate sleepers back into a coordinated group. The exact sounds and gestures are lost, but the social principle is not difficult to understand. Spacing made cooling easier, while communication had to replace some of the protection lost when bodies no longer touched. This helps explain why sleeping together could remain valuable even when heat made closeness physically unpleasant. The group did not need to occupy one dense circle to remain a group. It could stretch across shaded ground, around several small fires, or beneath the open edge of a shelter while preserving a shared field of hearing and response. Warm nights therefore reveal something important about ancient sleep. Safety did not come from one fixed arrangement. It changed with temperature, season, landscape, and the ages of the people present. The same community that compressed itself during cold weather could loosen during heat, then draw inward again when wind or rain arrived. This flexibility was likely more useful than any single ideal sleeping pattern. It allowed people to balance cooling, caregiving, vigilance, and access to fire without solving one problem so completely that every other problem became worse. But the balance remained fragile. The open spacing that released body heat also exposed more ground to sudden weather. A camp arranged for airflow could become difficult to maintain when warm winds strengthened, rain crossed the sleeping area, or dampness settled into every surface. The next pressure on the warm night did not come from temperature alone, but from the storms, moisture, and lingering humidity that could transform the same open camp before morning. The first sign that a warm night was changing was not always rain. It could begin with the air growing still, insects briefly quieting, and a low wind arriving from beyond the edge of the camp. A sleeping place arranged for heat relief was sensitive to this change. Bodies had been spread apart to catch movement of air the night offered. Coverings had been kept light, and the group had been left more open than it would have been in cold weather. Those choices made sense while the air remained warm and calm. Once a storm approached, the same arrangement became vulnerable. Warm season storms can build rapidly because heated ground and moisture in the air create conditions in which rising air forms dense clouds, strong winds, and sudden rain. The people beneath those clouds would not have understood the process in modern terms, but repeated experience would have taught them to recognize its signs. A shift in wind, a darkening horizon, distant thunder, or the smell of wet ground arriving before the first drops. Darkness reduced the time available to respond. During daylight, a group could examine the sky, move possessions, strengthen a shelter, or choose higher ground. At night, the first clear warning might come only when wind began lifting leaves, blowing ash from the fire, or pushing rain beneath whatever cover had been arranged. A camp occupying a wide area because of heat could not be gathered quickly. People lying at the edge might need to move toward the center. Children had to be brought under cover, and tools, food, fuel, or containers left nearby could be scattered or soaked before everyone was fully awake. Rain itself was not always the greatest danger. In a warm climate, a brief shower might bring relief after a hot day. The more serious problem came when rain was heavy, persistent, or driven sideways by wind. Simple shelters made from branches, leaves, grass, hides, or other local materials could divert some water, but their effectiveness depended on construction and the direction of the storm. Archaeology rarely preserves such temporary structures clearly, especially in humid regions where plant material decomposes quickly, so it is difficult to reconstruct exactly how any early group protected itself. Later archaeological and ethnographic evidence shows that mobile communities often used lightweight shelters designed to be built, repaired, or abandoned with limited effort. Such structures offered flexibility, but they were not sealed rooms. Water could enter through gaps, collect beneath low points, or run across the ground from outside. The sleeping surface then became part of the weather problem. Ground chosen because it felt cool during the evening might become a shallow channel once rain began. A depression that had offered protection from wind could fill with water. A place near a river or lake, valuable because it provided drinking water, could become less secure when runoff raised the water level or softened the soil. Groups familiar with the same landscape would have learned which places drained quickly, which trees offered useful cover, and which low areas became dangerous after heavy rain. That knowledge was practical and local. Even so, storms could reverse the value of a sleeping site within hours. Open ground that had provided airflow became exposed to wind. Dense vegetation that had provided shade began dripping after the main rain had passed. A fire maintained for light and protection could weaken under falling water, reducing visibility as the group moved closer together again. The warm night therefore demanded another rapid change in social shape. Bodies that had separated to release heat now had to gather beneath limited cover, bringing trapped warmth and dampness back into the sleeping space. The storm did not simply interrupt rest. It forced the group to exchange one set of risks for another before the night was over, and when the rain finally eased, the deeper problem of moisture was only beginning. When the rain stopped, the night did not return to the condition it had been in before the storm. The air remained heavy, leaves continued to drip, and the ground held water in places that had seemed dry only a few hours earlier. This lingering moisture created a different kind of danger from the sudden wind and rain that had first awakened the camp. A storm was visible and immediate. Humidity worked more slowly. It settled into coverings, clothing, hair, wood, soil, and every surface used for rest, making the entire sleeping environment harder to dry and harder to manage. In warm air, evaporation can already be limited when the surrounding atmosphere carries a great deal of moisture. After rain, that limitation becomes stronger. Sweat remains on the skin, but water from the environment also remains there, so the body cannot easily tell the difference between moisture produced for cooling and moisture imposed from outside. The skin stays damp, yet the body may still struggle to release heat. This is the central discomfort of a warm, wet night. A person can feel soaked without feeling cooled. Coverings that once protected against insects or light wind become heavy and cling to the body. Plant bedding compresses under moisture and loses the air spaces that helped separate skin from the ground. Hides and woven materials, where they were available, could shed some water depending on how they had been prepared. But once saturated, they also became slow to dry in still humid conditions. Archaeology preserves little of these ordinary materials, especially in tropical environments, so it cannot show precisely how often people woke to wet bedding or how long a particular sleeping surface remained usable. Yet the physical problem is straightforward. A wet surface transfers heat differently, supports less comfortable rest, and encourages repeated movement as sleepers search for a patch that is less damp than the one beneath them. Moisture also changed the condition of the skin itself. Prolonged dampness softens its outer layer, especially where skin remains pressed against another surface or where friction repeats through the night. Feet, folds of skin, and places beneath coverings can become irritated more easily when they remain wet for hours. Small cuts, insect bites, and scratches already present from the day are more difficult to keep clean when mud, sweat, and damp plant material remain in contact with them. This does not mean every wet night produced illness, and it would be misleading to treat ordinary humidity as a direct cause of severe disease on its own. The more cautious point is that persistent moisture weakened the simple barriers that kept minor injuries minor. It created conditions in which irritation lasted longer, sleep was disturbed more often, and cleaning or drying the body became harder until sunlight and moving air returned. The fire, so useful against darkness and animals, now became part of another trade-off. Bringing damp materials near it could help them dry, but smoke gathered more heavily when people crowded beneath limited cover. Fuel collected before the storm might burn poorly after becoming wet, producing less heat and more smoke at the very moment the group needed both light and drying. People might move closer to the fire for practical reasons, even though the air was still warm, accepting additional heat in exchange for the chance to dry coverings, warm a wet child, or preserve a small area of usable ground. By the hours before dawn, the camp could feel warmer, wetter, smokier, and more crowded than it had at sunset. The storm had passed, but its moisture remained inside the social space of sleep, turning every attempt at rest into a negotiation between ventilation, dryness, insects, smoke, and the need to stay together. And beyond the camp, the same rain was already changing rivers, slopes, and low ground in ways that might not become visible until morning. By morning, the most dangerous changes caused by a warm season storm were often no longer falling from the sky. They were moving across the ground. Water gathered on higher slopes during the night could begin running through channels that had been dry at sunset, carrying loose soil, branches, and stones toward lower ground where people had chosen to sleep for shade, water access, or protection from wind. A camp beside a river, stream, or lake had solved one central problem of a hot night by keeping drinking water close, but heavy rain could reverse the value of that same location. Banks softened, shallow channels widened, and ground that had seemed firm could become unstable before anyone understood how much water had fallen beyond the visible camp. In darkness, this change was difficult to judge. Rain striking leaves, shelters, and wet soil could mask the deeper sound of moving water nearby. A river might rise gradually until it crossed a familiar edge, while a smaller channel could fill quickly after rain fell far upstream. The danger did not depend only on standing beside a large river. Low ground, dry gullies, and shallow depressions could all collect runoff, especially where compacted soil prevented water from soaking in quickly. A sleeping place selected because it was level and cool might therefore become the path water followed once the storm continued long enough. Groups familiar with the landscape would have carried practical knowledge about these patterns. They could remember which banks flooded after heavy rain, which slopes shed stones, which trees stood on firmer ground, and which open areas remained above ordinary runoff. This knowledge would have been learned through repeated observation and shared across generations. Yet familiarity did not remove uncertainty. Warm season storms vary in strength and direction, and a place that remained safe through many rains could still become dangerous during an unusual downpour. Moving in the middle of the night also carried risks. Wet ground concealed holes and roots, mud slowed movement, and darkness made it harder to keep children, older people, tools, food, and fuel together while leaving a threatened site. A group might hesitate, balancing the danger of staying against the danger of moving without clear visibility. This was another difference between a warm storm and a cold night. Cold made the threat felt directly through the body, while floodwater and unstable ground could remain partly invisible until the environment itself began to shift. Slopes presented a related problem. Saturated soil becomes heavier and loses some of the strength holding it together, particularly where the surface is steep or earlier erosion has weakened the ground. Most warm rains would not have caused a major collapse, and it would be inaccurate to imagine landslides around every ancient camp. The more realistic danger was local: a small fall of soil, a branch brought down by wet weight, stones loosened above a shelter, or the slow collapse of an edge beside a channel. These changes were enough to damage a temporary shelter or force people to abandon the driest part of a camp before dawn. When light returned, the group could finally evaluate what darkness had hidden. Water levels, broken branches, fresh channels, softened banks, and deposits of mud revealed whether the site remained usable. A place chosen repeatedly in dry weather might be rejected for the rest of the wet season. Another might be preferred because it stood slightly higher, drained faster, caught more wind, or remained close enough to water without sitting directly in its path. In this way, warm season weather shaped more than one difficult night. It contributed to accumulated knowledge of where people could safely return, where they should sleep only during dry periods, and which parts of a landscape became dangerous when warmth, rain, and darkness arrived together. That knowledge rarely survives directly, but the locations ancient people repeatedly selected may still preserve part of it. The first challenge in searching for ancient warm-season sleeping places is that sleep itself leaves almost nothing behind. A person lying beneath a tree, beside a river, or on a patch of shaded ground does not create a clear archaeological signature simply by resting there for one night. Bodies move on, leaves decay, woven coverings disappear, and the shallow impressions left in soil are erased by wind, rain, animals, and later human activity. What survives is usually indirect: hearths, stone tools, food remains, broken shells, post holes, concentrations of ash, and the broader location of a site within the landscape. Archaeologists therefore rarely identify a place and say with certainty that people slept there specifically because the night was hot. Instead, they study repeated patterns across many sites and ask whether certain locations offered advantages that would have mattered in warm conditions. One of the clearest patterns is proximity to water. Early human activity is frequently found near lakes, rivers, springs, wetlands, and ancient shorelines, not because every group lived permanently beside open water, but because reliable access to drinking water strongly shaped where people could remain for any length of time. On a warm night, this advantage would have continued after sunset. A camp near water reduced the distance people had to travel when the body had already lost moisture through the heat of the day, and it allowed the group to begin the night with a better chance of avoiding the quiet deficit described earlier. Yet archaeological location alone cannot prove that people selected a site specifically for nighttime thirst. Water also attracted plants, animals, raw materials, and food, so its importance was broader than sleep. The careful conclusion is not that every waterside site was a hot weather bedroom, but that many such places combined several necessities in a way that made repeated occupation, including sleeping, more practical. Shade is harder to see in the archaeological record because trees rarely survive in a form that reveals exactly where their canopy once spread. Even so, ancient pollen, preserved wood, plant remains, and reconstructed vegetation can help researchers estimate whether a site once stood near woodland, riverbank trees, or open grassland. In warm environments, a shaded area would have offered relief long before darkness fell. Ground protected from direct afternoon sun stores less heat than exposed stone or bare soil, so the place that felt tolerable at sunset was often determined by conditions created hours earlier. A group returning repeatedly to the same sheltered edge, rock overhang, grove, or river terrace may have been responding not only to protection from rain and animals, but also to the way that place cooled after sunset. Again, this is an inference rather than a fact preserved directly in soil. The record rarely tells researchers what a place felt like against the skin. It reveals orientation, elevation, nearby water, exposure to wind, and traces of repeated human presence, from which thermal advantages can be considered alongside many other explanations. The ground itself offers another clue. Raised terraces, gently sloping surfaces, sandy soils, and places with natural drainage often appear more suitable for repeated occupation than low depressions that trap water after storms. In warm seasons, such positions could provide two benefits at once: ground cool enough to rest on after sunset, but high and porous enough to avoid becoming saturated when rain arrived. Some sites also occupy positions where breezes are more likely, such as open ridges, valley edges, or entrances to rock shelters facing prevailing winds. Archaeologists must be cautious here because wind patterns change, landscapes erode, and later sediment can alter the shape of a site. Still, when repeated occupation occurs in locations combining water access, shade, drainage, and airflow, the pattern suggests that ancient people were reading the thermal character of a landscape with great care, even though the exact sleeping arrangements have vanished. Rock shelters and cave entrances offer a second kind of archaeological clue because they preserve evidence more clearly than open ground. Ash, stone tools, animal bones, plant remains, and repeated hearths can accumulate in layers beneath protected ceilings, allowing archaeologists to reconstruct patterns of occupation across long periods. Yet even here, the presence of people does not automatically mean the deepest part of a cave was always the preferred place to sleep. In warm conditions, a cave could provide shade and a cooler surface during the day, but its interior might also hold still air, smoke, dampness, and the heat produced by several bodies and a fire. The most comfortable zone may therefore have been near the entrance rather than far inside, where sleepers could benefit from shade without losing all access to moving air. The orientation of an entrance could matter as well. A shelter facing away from the strongest afternoon sun might remain cooler by evening, while one exposed directly to late sunlight could store heat in its walls and floor long after darkness arrived. Some entrances also catch prevailing winds more effectively than others. Archaeologists can measure direction, topography, and the surrounding landscape, but these details must be interpreted carefully because wind systems and vegetation may have changed since the site was occupied. Even so, repeated use of particular zones within shelters can reveal practical preferences. Hearths placed near entrances rather than deep inside may have allowed smoke to escape while still maintaining light and a protective boundary. Concentrations of tools or food remains toward the rear might indicate storage or work areas, while cleaner, less disturbed surfaces closer to a wall could have served as resting spaces. These interpretations are rarely certain, because later activity mixes deposits and because the same area may have served several functions at different times. Still, the organization of space shows that ancient people were not simply entering a shelter and using every part of it equally. They responded to airflow, smoke, light, moisture, and the temperature of stone surfaces, all of which changed through the day and across the seasons. Seasonal occupation is especially difficult to identify, but it can sometimes be inferred from animal remains, plant foods, pollen, growth rings, shell formation, or the timing of migrations and harvests represented at a site. When evidence suggests that a shelter was used repeatedly during warmer months, its location and internal arrangement become more relevant to the problem of hot nights. A site beside water, under a rock overhang, with an open entrance and naturally drained ground, would offer a combination of advantages: shade before sunset, access to drinking water, some protection from rain, and enough ventilation to prevent the sleeping area from becoming completely enclosed. Yet the same location could also attract insects, animals, and moisture, so no site was ideal in every respect. The archaeological record often reveals this compromise through movement within the site itself. Hearth shift position. Activity areas appear in one layer and disappear in another. Occupation becomes denser during some periods and thinner during others. These changes may reflect climate, season, available resources, group size, or many causes acting together. It would be too strong to claim that every shift records a response to heat. What can be said more safely is that ancient groups repeatedly adjusted where they rested within familiar landscapes rather than relying on one permanent sleeping arrangement. They learned which surfaces remained cool, which entrances carried smoke away, which ledges stayed dry, and which shaded areas became uncomfortable when the air turned still. The evidence is fragmentary, but it points toward practical knowledge built from returning to the same places and noticing how each one behaved after sunset. The strongest archaeological evidence for warm season sleeping places does not come from a single object or a single dramatic discovery. It comes from patterns repeated across landscapes. Camps near dependable water but not always on the lowest ground. Shelters positioned to catch air without taking the full force of storms. Activity areas arranged around shade, drainage and fire, and places revisited often enough for thin traces to accumulate into something archaeologists can recognize. No one hearth proves that people chose a site because the night was hot. No scatter of stone tools proves that sleepers preferred a cooler surface. But when location, orientation, season, and repeated use point in the same direction, a broader picture begins to emerge. Ancient people were not merely occupying whatever ground happened to be available. They were reading the behavior of places. They noticed which soil released the day's heat quickly, which rock walls remained warm after sunset, which river terraces offered water without flooding easily, and which shelter entrances allowed smoke to leave while preserving enough cover from rain. Much of that knowledge would never have needed to be spoken as a formal rule. It could be learned through repetition, through where older members of a group chose to stop, where children were placed, where bedding was spread, and which locations were avoided after a difficult night. Archaeology cannot recover those conversations, gestures, or memories. It can only recover the uneven material residue left behind after people moved on. This creates an important imbalance in the evidence. A durable stone hearth may survive for thousands of years, while the reason it was placed a few steps closer to an entrance disappears entirely. A cave floor may preserve ash, bone, and tools, while the open, breezier ground used for sleeping just beyond the drip line leaves almost nothing. Warm, humid regions intensify this problem because organic materials decay quickly. Soils are disturbed by roots and insects, and repeated rain can wash away the lightest traces of temporary camps. The absence of a clear sleeping surface, therefore, cannot be treated as evidence that no careful choice existed. In many cases, it may mean only that the choice was made with materials and behaviors least likely to survive. This is why archaeologists often combine several kinds of evidence rather than relying on one source alone. Site elevation can be compared with ancient water levels. Pollen and plant remains can suggest whether shade was available. Sediments can show whether the ground flooded or drained. Burned material can reveal where fires were maintained, while the distribution of tools and food remains can suggest which areas were used most intensively. None of these clues speaks directly about sleep, but together they can outline the conditions under which sleep became possible. The picture that emerges is not one of a perfect refuge from heat, it is one of compromise. The coolest place might be too damp, the breeziest place might be too exposed. The safest rock shelter might trap smoke, while the driest ground might lie farther from water. Ancient groups had to choose among imperfect options, adjusting as seasons changed and as experience accumulated. In that sense, the most important archaeological trace may not be a particular shelter at all, but the repeated human tendency to return to certain kinds of places: shaded edges, elevated water margins, ventilated entrances, and ground that remained usable after rain. These choices suggest a practical geography of warm night survival, built slowly and transmitted across generations. And once that geography is recognized, another fact becomes harder to ignore. Many of the people making these choices were not enduring occasional summer heat at the edge of a colder world. They were living in regions where warm nights were the ordinary condition of life. When the human story is imagined against a frozen background, it becomes easy to forget that cold was never the original condition of our species. Homo sapiens emerged in Africa, and the deeper human lineage had already been living across African landscapes for millions of years before any population established a lasting presence in the colder regions of Europe or Northern Asia. Those African landscapes were not uniform. They included grasslands, wooded areas, lake margins, highlands, dry interiors, and humid coastal or forest environments, each changing repeatedly as rainfall and temperature shifted. Yet much of this long history unfolded within tropical and subtropical latitudes, where a warm night was not an unusual seasonal interruption but an ordinary part of life. Even periods described by scientists as ice ages did not cover the entire planet in snow. Large ice sheets expanded mainly across northern regions, while populations closer to the equator continued to experience nights shaped more by heat, rainfall, drought, and humidity than by freezing temperatures. This matters because the phrase ancient human can quietly combine people separated by enormous distances and hundreds of thousands of years into one misleading image. A group living near an East African lake did not face the same night as a group occupying a European valley during a cold phase. Nor did people along a southern African coast experience darkness in the same way as communities living on a high, dry plateau. There was no single prehistoric climate and therefore no single prehistoric night. The earliest Homo sapiens fossils found across different parts of Africa support a broad African origin rather than a story confined to one tiny birthplace, and archaeological evidence shows human populations responding to many habitats within the continent long before the best-known expansions into Eurasia. Their challenges changed with local altitude, vegetation, rainfall, and season, but many of these people lived where retaining body heat was not the central problem for most nights of the year. Some highlands and deserts could become cold after sunset, and no careful account should replace the myth of universal cold with an equally simple myth of universal warmth. The important point is proportion and chronology. Cold-adapted human life became especially important as populations moved farther into temperate and northern environments, but this was a later expansion of a much older human relationship with warm climates. Even after people spread widely beyond Africa, migration did not lead only towards snow and ice. Human groups also moved through southern Asia, coastal regions, islands, tropical forests, river valleys, and warm grasslands. Many populations continued living with hot or humid nights for generation after generation, while others experienced warmth during long summers even in regions that became cold in winter. The familiar image of everyone crouched against freezing wind therefore represents one real human experience, but not the human experience as a whole. Archaeological preservation has helped strengthen that imbalance. Cold and dry settings can preserve bone, wood, fibers, and other traces more clearly than warm, wet environments, where organic material often decays quickly and heavy rainfall disturbs shallow sites. The places most visible to archaeology are not always the places where most people lived or where the longest chapters unfolded. A warm night camp beneath trees may vanish almost completely, while a cave occupied during a cold season can preserve layered hearths and bones for thousands of years. What survives can shape what later generations imagine. Once that bias is recognized, the map of ancient danger changes. Heat, thirst, insects, storms, dampness, and interrupted sleep no longer appear as side problems beside the supposedly central struggle against cold. They become recurring pressures belonging to vast regions and long periods of human time. The question is no longer whether some ancestors endured hot nights. It is how much of the human story was formed under nights that never became cold at all. Once the map of human history is widened beyond the colder regions that dominate popular images, another pattern becomes clear. Many communities did not encounter hot nights as a short summer problem. They lived with them as the normal condition of the year. Near the equator, the length of day and night changes less dramatically across the seasons, and temperatures often remain warm long after sunset. Along tropical coasts, moisture from the sea can keep the air heavy even when direct sunlight has disappeared. In river valleys and wetland margins, water supports human life while also increasing humidity, insect activity, and the persistence of damp ground. These environments were not marginal to the human story. They included some of the landscapes through which early Homo sapiens lived, moved, and adapted for very long periods. A person growing up in such a place would not have divided the year into a long cold season and a brief interval of heat. Warm darkness would have been familiar from childhood, repeated so often that the knowledge needed to endure it became part of ordinary life rather than an emergency response. Sleeping places had to be chosen with airflow in mind. Water had to remain close enough to reach, but not so close that every rain threatened the camp. Shade mattered before sunset, because the heat stored by the ground during the afternoon shaped the comfort of the night that followed. Fire had to be maintained for light, insects, and animals, even when no one wanted the additional warmth it produced. These were not separate problems solved once and forgotten. They returned together, and the balance among them changed from one landscape to another. A coastal breeze might cool exposed ground but also carry rain. Dense vegetation might provide shade while reducing airflow. A river terrace might offer drinking water and a cooler surface while attracting insects and animals to the same narrow strip of land. Living in a warm region therefore did not mean that every night was equally dangerous or equally uncomfortable. Dry seasons, wet seasons, elevation, wind, and local vegetation could change conditions greatly. Some tropical highlands became cool after dark, while some dry interiors lost heat quickly once the sun set. The careful point is not that all equatorial or tropical nights were hot in exactly the same way. It is that millions of people across many periods lived in climates where warm nights were common enough to shape repeated habits, expectations, and settlement choices. This long familiarity may also explain why traces of hot night adaptation are often difficult to identify as special technologies. A stone wall built against cold wind is visible. A decision to sleep beneath a particular tree, to move a mat closer to an opening, or to leave more space between bodies is far less likely to survive. Much of warm climate adaptation may have existed in timing, movement, and local knowledge rather than in durable objects. People learned when the evening wind usually arrived, which water sources remained usable after rain, where insects gathered most densely, and which ground cooled fastest after sunset. Such knowledge could be passed through demonstration and memory, without leaving a clear archaeological object behind. This helps explain why cold weather survival appears more concrete in the material record, even when warm night survival may have occupied a larger share of everyday human experience. The hidden history of hot nights is therefore not hidden because it was rare. It is hidden because ordinary adjustments made in warm environments often vanished with the people who practiced them. What remains is a broad geographic truth. For many ancient populations, heat after dark was not an exception to prepare for. It was the background against which generations learned how to sleep. The deeper the human timeline is followed, the harder it becomes to treat cold as the main condition against which all ancient nights should be measured. Cold mattered greatly in some regions, especially as human populations expanded into higher latitudes and learned to survive winters that demanded shelter, fuel, clothing, and cooperation. But that achievement belongs inside a broader story rather than replacing it. Long before humans occupied glacial Europe or the northern plains of Asia, their ancestors had already spent immense stretches of time living in African landscapes where freezing nights were uncommon and warmth remained a more regular presence. Even after people dispersed beyond Africa, many routes led through southern coasts, river systems, islands, forests, and tropical grasslands rather than directly into snow. Entire populations continued to live in these warmer regions while other groups adapted to colder ones, so the history of the species never moved in a single climatic direction. It divided, overlapped, and changed with geography. This makes the familiar frozen image useful only when it is treated as one regional chapter. It becomes misleading when it is allowed to stand for the whole book. The warm night was not a minor interval between more important cold seasons. In many places it was the ordinary setting of human sleep, repeated across childhood, adulthood, and old age, shaping where camps were placed, how bodies were spaced, when water was gathered, how fire was managed, and how much uninterrupted rest could be expected before morning. Its dangers were often less visible because they did not always produce one dramatic moment. Heat could fragment sleep without leaving a wound. Humidity could soften skin without leaving a durable mark. Insects could disturb the body repeatedly, while leaving little that archaeology could recover. Storms could force a camp to move, then wash away much of the evidence that the camp had existed at all. The warmer and wetter the environment, the more likely its ordinary materials were to decay, and the more likely the human adjustments made there were to survive only as knowledge, habit, and biological response. This creates a quiet distortion in the surviving record. Cold weather adaptations often appear as objects: stone structures, hearths, preserved hides, bone tools, and protected cave deposits. Warm night adaptations often appear as absence: a better choice of shade, a wider distance between sleepers, a decision to move uphill before rain, or a preference for an entrance where air circulated. The first kind of evidence can be excavated. The second often disappears. Yet disappearance is not evidence of insignificance. It may instead reveal how deeply these behaviors were woven into ordinary movement, rather than fixed architecture. Once this imbalance is recognized, the ancient night becomes more varied and more human. Some groups feared cold enough to huddle closely around fire. Others feared losing water, sleeping too near a flooded channel, or lying where the air would not move. Many faced both kinds of night at different times of year. Human survival depended not on mastering one universal climate, but on reading each landscape carefully and changing behavior before discomfort became danger. This flexibility may be one of the most important continuities across the species. The body did not become indifferent to heat, simply because generations learned where to find shade or how to arrange a camp. It continued to react through sweating, thirst, restless sleep, and the search for cooler surfaces. Those reactions remain familiar now, even in rooms separated from the ancient landscape by walls, roofs, fans, and artificial cooling. The geography has changed, but the body has not forgotten the warm night. The clearest trace of the ancient warm night may be found not in a cave floor or a line of hearths, but in the way the modern body still prepares itself for sleep. Long before walls, fans, air conditioning, or temperature-controlled bedding existed, human sleep depended on the same basic change it still depends on now. The body must release some of its internal heat before deeper sleep can begin. As evening approaches, blood flow shifts toward the skin, especially through the hands and feet, allowing warmth to move outward from the body's core. This gradual cooling is not simply a preference for comfort. It is part of the biological timing system that helps the brain and body move from wakefulness into sleep. When the surrounding air is cool enough, the process happens with relatively little effort. Heat moves outward, the skin releases it, and the internal temperature can fall along the path sleep requires. When the night remains hot, the same process becomes slower and less effective. The skin may feel warm or damp, yet the body still fails to lose enough heat. Sleep becomes lighter, movement increases, and brief awakenings become more common. This reaction can feel strangely disproportionate in modern life. A person may be lying safely in a quiet room, with no insects, no animal movement, no shortage of drinking water, and no need to guard a fire, yet a small rise in nighttime temperature can still make rest feel difficult. The reason is that the body is responding to temperature through a system far older than the room surrounding it. It does not know that the walls are secure or that water is available a few steps away. It only registers that heat is not leaving efficiently, and that the internal conditions required for stable sleep have not been reached. This does not mean the modern body carries a precise memory of individual ancient nights. Biological inheritance does not preserve experiences in that way. What survives is a set of responses shaped over a long evolutionary history: sweating when heat rises, widening blood vessels near the skin, seeking cooler surfaces, uncovering the limbs, changing position, and waking when thermal strain becomes difficult to ignore. These reactions are automatic enough that people often perform them without remembering. A sleeper pushes away a blanket, turns toward an open window, spreads the arms or legs, or moves to the cooler side of a bed before becoming fully conscious. The behavior resembles the wider sleeping arrangement described earlier, not because modern bedrooms reproduce prehistoric camps, but because the underlying problem remains the same. Heat must leave the body, and space around the skin helps it do so. Modern research also shows that the temperature most comfortable for falling asleep is not always the temperature most comfortable during waking activity. The body can tolerate warmth while sitting quietly in the evening, then find the same room oppressive once sleep begins. This change reflects the natural reduction in the body's ability to regulate temperature during certain stages of sleep. The sleeper becomes more dependent on the surrounding environment at exactly the time conscious choices are least available. That dependence would have been present throughout human history, whether a person slept beneath leaves, inside a rock shelter, beside a river, or later within a built house. Artificial cooling has changed the environment around sleep, but it has not removed the ancient requirement beneath it. The body still waits for the night to become cool enough to let go of the day's heat, and when that cooling does not come, sleep remains cautious, shallow, and easily broken. Another trace of the ancient warm night appears in the way thirst and humidity disturb sleep before the body reaches any obvious state of danger. In modern life, a person can wake with a dry mouth, damp skin, or a vague sense of discomfort even when water is nearby and the room itself is safe. These sensations may seem minor, but they reflect the same basic problem ancient bodies faced. Water continues to leave the body through breathing and sweating during sleep, while the sleeper cannot respond continuously to that loss. The brain does not wait until dehydration becomes severe before changing the depth of sleep. Rising thirst, warmer skin, and a faster heartbeat can all make rest lighter and increase the chance of waking. In the past, such waking may have been useful because it created an opportunity to drink, move to cooler ground, adjust distance from the fire, or notice a change in the surrounding camp. In a modern bedroom, the same reaction can feel unnecessary, yet the body is still following an older rule. When internal conditions become less stable, sleep becomes less complete. Humidity adds another layer because it weakens the cooling value of sweat. A person may perspire heavily and still feel unable to cool, since moisture already filling the air slows evaporation from the skin. This is why a humid night can feel more oppressive than a dry night at the same temperature. The body is producing its normal cooling response, but the environment is preventing that response from working efficiently. Modern sleepers often react by spreading the limbs, turning repeatedly, moving away from another person, or seeking a surface that has not yet absorbed body heat. These small movements resemble the ancient adjustments described earlier, not as inherited memories of specific actions, but as direct solutions to the same physical limits. The body still benefits from airflow, exposed skin, cooler ground, and greater distance between sources of heat. Even sleeping beside another person can reveal this continuity. Closeness may feel reassuring, yet during a warm night, two bodies create a pocket of trapped heat and moisture between them. Without conscious discussion, sleepers often separate, turn in opposite directions, or remove shared coverings. The social bond remains, but the physical arrangement loosens, just as a warm ancient camp may have loosened while preserving hearing and awareness across the group. Modern walls remove many outside dangers, but they do not erase the body's sensitivity to warmth, thirst, and dampness. They may even make these reactions more noticeable because the old pressures now appear without the surrounding reasons that once gave them practical meaning. There is no predator beyond the bed, no riverbank to inspect, and no fire to maintain, yet sleep still becomes guarded when the body cannot cool or hold enough water. This does not prove that every modern awakening is an evolutionary adaptation, or that ancient humans were constantly dehydrated. Sleep can be disturbed by many causes, and heat responses vary with health, age, clothing, bedding, and personal acclimatization. The safer conclusion is that human sleep remains closely tied to conditions that mattered throughout deep history. Thirst, moisture, airflow, and the temperature of nearby bodies still shape how deeply a person can rest. The world around sleep has changed rapidly, but the body continues to measure the night through signals formed long before modern shelter made darkness feel controlled. This continuity is especially clear during the hours before dawn, when several hours of moisture loss have accumulated and the room may still hold the heat released by walls, bedding, and other bodies. A sleeper who wakes, drinks, turns a pillow, or moves toward cooler air is performing a quiet correction. The action is modern in setting, but ancient in purpose. Restore enough balance for sleep to continue. The final trace of the ancient warm night is not a single reflex, but the way several responses still arrive together. Heat rises, sweat begins, thirst becomes easier to notice, sleep grows lighter, and the body starts searching for space, airflow, and a cooler surface without waiting for a conscious plan. In modern surroundings, these reactions can seem excessive because the dangers that once accompanied them have largely been separated from the bedroom. A warm room does not usually mean an exposed riverbank, insects gathering near standing water, a weakening fire, or animals moving beyond the edge of a sleeping group. Yet the body does not evaluate the night by examining walls, locks, or weather forecasts. It responds to internal temperature, moisture loss, skin warmth, and the difficulty of releasing heat. When those signals move in the wrong direction, rest becomes more fragile. This continuity should not be mistaken for a flaw left behind by evolution. Waking briefly when overheated, moving away from another warm body, or seeking water can protect internal balance before the problem becomes more serious. In an ancient setting, the same waking might also have created a moment to hear approaching rain, notice a dying fire, or become aware of movement near the camp. One interruption could therefore serve several purposes at once, even though the person experiencing it would not have understood those purposes separately. The cost was that protection and restoration pulled in opposite directions. Deeper sleep required the body to surrender awareness and reduce some of its control over temperature, while a warm, uncertain environment rewarded light sleep and frequent correction. That tension has not disappeared. Modern cooling systems can reduce it, but they cannot rewrite the basic structure beneath it. They often conceal the body's sensitivity so effectively that it becomes visible only when electricity fails, ventilation stops, or an unfamiliar room holds more heat than expected. The sudden discomfort is not a new weakness. It is an old response revealed after the modern layer of protection has been removed. This may be why sudden power loss on a hot night feels so disruptive, or why an unfamiliar warm room can produce repeated waking even when a person knows they are safe. The conscious mind understands the setting while the sleeping body responds to conditions that once carried wider consequences. Age can make this pattern more visible because children, adults, and older people do not regulate temperature or sleep in exactly the same way. Health, hydration, clothing, bedding, acclimatization, and individual differences also matter, so there is no single temperature at which every person will react identically. It would be inaccurate to claim that one universal warm night response defines all humans. What is shared is more general. Stable sleep depends partly on the body being able to release heat, and when that becomes difficult, sleep tends to lose some of its depth and continuity. Seen across the full history of the species, this sensitivity makes sense. Human beings did not evolve in permanently cooled rooms where nighttime temperature could be held steady until morning. They slept in landscapes that changed hour by hour, where the ground release stored warmth slowly, humidity rose after rain, wind could vanish, and other bodies nearby added heat. The modern sleeper still carries a nervous system and a thermoregulatory system shaped under those variable conditions. A turned pillow, an uncovered foot, a drink of water, or a movement toward open air may look insignificant, but each is part of an ancient conversation between the body and the night. The response remains even when the original landscape is gone. And once this continuity is understood, the larger question returns. If warm nights left such persistent traces in the body, why has cold been allowed to tell almost the entire story of ancient danger? Return once more to the familiar image that opened this account. A dark, prehistoric landscape, a small fire, and human bodies gathered close because the cold beyond the light feels like the greatest danger in the world. That image still deserves its place. Cold could injure, weaken, and kill, and entire human communities learn to survive it through shelter, fuel, clothing, shared warmth, and careful movement across hostile seasons. But after following the warm night through the body, the camp, the landscape, and the surviving evidence, the image can no longer stand alone. It describes one kind of danger, not the whole meaning of darkness in human history. In many places, the night did not arrive with frost. It arrived with heat still held in the ground, moisture suspended in the air, and a body that could not cool itself simply because the sun had disappeared. Sweat continued, water left the skin, and sleep became lighter before any obvious crisis began. The group faced a different set of choices. It had to remain close enough for safety while leaving enough space for air to move. It needed water nearby, though water also drew insects, animals, and the risk of flooding. It needed fire, though fire added warmth to a night already carrying too much of it. Every useful response solved one problem while quietly strengthening another. That is the pattern warm nights reveal most clearly. Their danger was rarely singular. Cold can be imagined as one force pressing inward against the body. Heat at night worked through layers that were harder to separate. Thirst, humidity, insects, disturbed sleep, exposure, storms. and the social cost of spreading a sleeping group across wider ground. None of these needed to become extreme on a single night to matter. Repetition gave them weight. A person who slept lightly, woke thirsty, and began the next day less restored was not necessarily living through a disaster. Yet when the same pattern returned across a warm season, and then across many seasons, the cumulative cost became part of ordinary survival. This may be one reason it has remained less visible in popular memory. Human stories are drawn towards sudden events, a blizzard, a frozen body, a dramatic escape from snow. Warm night danger often left no comparable scene. It left damp bedding, a fire that could not be abandoned, an insect bite, a disturbed child, a move to higher ground, or a decision to sleep beneath a different tree the following evening. Archaeology rarely preserves such moments. The body preserves more of them than the soil does, in the continued need to cool before sleep, the tendency to wake when overheated, and the instinct to seek space, air, and water during the night. Seen together, these traces suggest that warmth was not the gentle opposite of cold. It was a separate environment of risk, demanding another kind of knowledge and another kind of endurance. The ancient night therefore becomes less simple, but also more truthful. It was not one universal test repeated everywhere. It changed with latitude, season, rainfall, altitude, vegetation, and the number and ages of people sleeping together. To understand it, the question can no longer be only how humans survived the cold. It must also ask what survival meant when the night stayed warm, and that question changes the scale of danger itself. A threat does not need to strike suddenly to shape a life. It can remain low, repetitive, and almost ordinary, entering the body through broken sleep, lost water, damp skin, and the need to stay partly alert when rest should have been deepest. The warm night mattered not because every one of its hours was deadly, but because so many of those hours returned, unnoticed and unrecorded, across the long human past. The danger of a warm ancient night becomes clearer when its separate pressures are no longer examined one at a time. Heat made sleep shallow, but shallow sleep also increased sensitivity to every insect, every distant sound, and every shift in the weather. Water had to remain close, but the places offering reliable water also brought damp ground, thicker insect activity, and more animal movement. Fire discouraged some threats and helped people see, yet it raised the temperature around a group already struggling to cool. Spreading bodies apart improved airflow, but widened the camp and made its boundary harder to watch. Rain relieved heat for a moment, then soaked bedding, weakened fuel, softened the ground, and forced people back into tighter shelter where warmth and smoke accumulated together. No single pressure explains the warm night by itself. Its real difficulty came from the way one solution repeatedly altered another problem. This was survival through negotiation rather than conquest. Ancient people did not defeat heat once, and then move on. They adjusted position, timing, distance, fire, water, and shelter again and again as the night changed around them. A breeze that felt useful at sunset might disappear before midnight. A dry patch of ground could become wet after rain. A riverbank that seemed safe in darkness might reveal fresh channels by morning. Even within the same camp, different bodies faced different limits. A child could lose heat and water differently from an adult. An older person might wake more easily, while someone exhausted by the day could sleep through sounds that would normally bring attention. Illness, pregnancy, injury, age, and simple variation meant that no arrangement protected everyone equally. The group survived not because every person responded in the same way, but because many different responses overlapped. One person noticed the fire, another heard the rain. Someone else remembered which higher ground remained dry during the last storm. Knowledge was distributed across people just as vigilance was distributed across the night. This may be one of the quieter lessons hidden inside the history of warm darkness. Human survival was not built only from strength, tools, or dramatic acts of courage. It was also built from small corrections made before danger became obvious. Drinking before sleep, moving a child away from trapped heat, leaving space between bodies, choosing a site slightly above the waterline, or waking long enough to listen before lying down again. None of these actions would become a story carved into stone. Most would leave no evidence at all. Yet repeated across generations, they could determine which groups rested well enough to travel, gather food, protect children, and make sound decisions the following day. The cost of a warm night therefore extended beyond the hours of darkness. Broken sleep carried into daylight. Water lost overnight narrowed the margin available during morning movement. Damp fuel affected cooking and protection. A flooded camp delayed departure. Irritated skin, infected bites, and accumulated fatigue could slowly weaken the body without any one event appearing severe enough to explain the decline. This is why the word dangerous must be used carefully here. It does not mean that every hot night placed every sleeper near death. It means that warmth created a recurring environment in which many small risks became more likely to combine, and in which the body had fewer opportunities for complete recovery. Cold could kill quickly when protection failed. Heat could also become acute, but much of its historical burden probably arrived through repetition, through nights that looked survivable in isolation, and became costly only when viewed across a season or a lifetime. The ancient warm night was dangerous not because it always produced catastrophe, but because it rarely allowed any single problem to remain alone. Return one final time to the night with which this story began, but allow the scene to hold more than cold. The fire is still there, and beyond it the dark is still uncertain, yet the air may be warm, the ground may still be giving back the heat of the day, and the people around the flames may be lying farther apart rather than drawing close. Nothing in this version is less ancient, less difficult, or less important. It simply belongs to the part of human history that survives more faintly in stone and soil. Cold announced itself through shivering, numbness, and the urgent need to preserve heat. Warmth often worked more quietly. It entered the night through thirst, damp skin, insects, restless sleep, smoke, rain, and the need to remain alert across a wider camp. Its danger did not always arrive as one dramatic event. More often, it accumulated through small losses that repeated until they shaped the following day, the following season, and perhaps the habits of generations. This is the central correction the warm night asks us to make. Human survival was never a contest against one climate alone. It was the ability to notice changing conditions and respond before any one of them became overwhelming. Sometimes that meant gathering close. Sometimes it meant leaving space between bodies. Sometimes the safest place was near water. And sometimes the same water made the ground too wet or drew too much life into the darkness. Sometimes fire was warmth, and sometimes it was light, smoke, orientation, or a boundary maintained despite the heat it added. The meaning of every tool and every arrangement changed with the night around it. That flexibility is more important than the image of any single perfect adaptation. Ancient people did not possess control over temperature. They possessed knowledge of places, seasons, winds, surfaces, and one another. They learned which ground cooled quickly, which banks flooded, which shelters trapped smoke, and which members of the group tended to wake before the others. Much of that knowledge disappeared because it was carried in behavior rather than objects. It lived in where someone chose to lie, when water was collected, how far a child was placed from the fire, and when a camp was abandoned before rain. These acts were ordinary, but ordinary acts are often what survival is made from. The same lesson remains useful when looking at the human body now. Our sleep still depends on cooling. Our rest still becomes fragile when heat and humidity prevent the body from releasing the day. We still uncover our feet, seek moving air, turn to the cooler side of a surface, and wake thirsty before the situation becomes truly dangerous. Modern shelter has changed the consequences, but not the underlying relationship between sleep and temperature. The body still treats the warm night as something that requires attention. So the old picture does not need to be rejected. It needs to be widened. The frozen landscape, the huddled group, and the life-preserving fire remain part of the truth. Beside them must now stand another scene, a humid darkness, bodies spaced across shaded ground, water close but never simple, and sleep repeatedly interrupted by a world that has not cooled or gone still. Cold was one killer in the ancient night. Heat was another, often quieter, often less visible, and carried through the long human past in ways the archaeological record can only partly recover. When we imagine our ancestors sleeping beneath the open sky, which danger have we remembered clearly, and which one is still waiting in the dark to be understood?